but I hold the power to take away every spotless reputation.
My mother-in-law poured an entire bottle of red wine over my wedding dress 3 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. Then she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Some women need to be reminded where they belong." What she did not know was that I had spent the previous night reading the documents that could take away her company, her mansion, and the spotless reputation she had spent 30 years building. Hello, my name is Olivia Bennett. I was 34 years old when I learned that revenge does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it wears a simple white dress, carries a sealed envelope, and walks calmly toward the altar. I met my husband, Ethan Mercer, 2 years before our wedding. We were both standing in line at a small coffee shop in Boston when the man in front of me knocked my cup onto my blouse and hurried away without apologizing. Ethan handed me a stack of napkins and said, "For what it's worth, I think coffee brown is your color." I laughed, even though I wanted to be angry. That was Ethan. He could make a hard moment feel lighter, without pretending it had not happened. He was an architect. I was a forensic accountant. He designed buildings that were meant to stand for 100 years. I studied numbers until they confessed what people tried to hide. We fell in love slowly. Sunday walks became weekend trips. Weekend trips became a shared apartment. 18 months after we met, Ethan proposed beside the Charles River with a small ring that had belonged to his grandmother, Rose. I said yes before he finished asking. Then I met his mother. Lorraine Mercer lived in a stone mansion outside the city. She was 61, elegant, controlled, and never seen without perfect hair and a string of pearls. She ran Mercer Home, a luxury furniture company founded by Ethan's late father, Thomas. At our first dinner, Lorraine studied me as if I were a chair someone had delivered in the wrong color. "Forensic accounting," she said. "How serious?" "I enjoy it," I answered. "Then usually prefers creative women." Ethan reached for my hand under the table. Lorraine smiled. "Of course, stability has its uses." Every insult came wrapped like a gift. If I objected, she could claim I had misunderstood. At first, I tried to win her over. I sent flowers on her birthday. I helped organize a fundraiser for the company's employee relief fund. I listened to stories about Ethan as a child, even when Lorraine used those stories to remind me that she knew him better than I ever could. Nothing worked. When we announced our engagement, Lorraine stared at the ring and said, "Rose wanted that to stay in the family." I looked at Ethan. I thought I was joining the family. Lorraine lifted her wine glass. "We'll see." Ethan confronted her that night. She cried, said she was grieving her husband, and accused him of abandoning her. By morning, he was apologizing to both of us. That became her pattern. She caused the wound, then demanded comfort because everyone had noticed the blood. I should have understood then that Lorraine did not want peace. She wanted control. The wedding was scheduled for October at Hawthorne House, an old estate overlooking a lake in western Massachusetts. Ethan and I paid for most of it ourselves. Lorraine insisted on covering the flowers and rehearsal dinner. "It's my only son's wedding," she said. "I must contribute something." Her contribution soon became authority. She changed the flowers without telling me. She added 40 business contacts to the guest list. She asked the caterer to replace our simple menu with one she considered more appropriate for the Mercer name. Each time, I restored our original choices. Lorraine began calling me stubborn. Boundaries often feel like stubbornness to people who are used to getting their way. I told her. That was the first time I saw real hatred in her eyes. The wedding dress became the center of our war. I did not want an expensive designer gown. My mother, who died when I was 26, had left me her wedding veil. It was soft ivory lace with tiny hand-sewn flowers along the edge. I found a local seamstress named Elena, who designed a simple silk gown to match it. The dress cost less than the floral arch Lorraine ordered without permission, but it meant everything to me. At the final fitting, I cried when Elena placed my mother's veil over my hair. Lorraine stood behind me and said, "It looks homemade." Elena froze. I met Lorraine's reflection in the mirror. "It looks like me. That is what worries me." Ethan's sister, Paige, pulled Lorraine aside. Paige was 29 and had spent most of her life trying not to provoke her mother. She later apologized to me in the parking lot. "She's getting worse." Paige whispered. "Dad used to stop her." Thomas Mercer had died from a heart attack 18 months before I met Ethan. According to Ethan, his father had been warm, patient, and deeply involved in Mercer Home. After his death, Lorraine became chief executive and trustee of the family shares until Ethan and Paige turned 35. Ethan rarely spoke about the business. He owned shares, but architecture was his life. Paige worked at Mercer Home as director of community relations, though Lorraine treated her more like an assistant. 10 days before the wedding, Paige called me after midnight. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "I found something," she said. And I think Mom knows I found it. We met at an all-night diner outside Cambridge. Paige arrived carrying an old leather document case that had belonged to her father. Inside were bank statements, board minutes, trust documents, and a handwritten letter signed by Thomas Mercer. Paige pushed them toward me. "I don't know what any of this means," she said. "But Dad wrote that Ethan and I were supposed to receive voting control when he died. Mom told us the shares stayed in trust until we turned 35. I read the trust agreement twice. The page transferring voting authority to Lorraine looked normal at first. Then I noticed that the notary's stamp was dated 3 days after the notary's commission had expired. The signature attributed to Thomas leaned slightly to the left. His signature on the original trust leaned right. That alone was suspicious. The bank statements were worse. Over 18 months. Nearly $2 million had moved from Mercer Home into 3 consulting companies. All 3 companies shared the same mailing address, a private mailbox, registered to Lorraine's personal attorney, Victor Hale. "Paige," I said carefully, "where did you get this?" Dad had a storage locker. Mom told us it contained old samples. The facility called because the payment card expired. Does anyone else know? Victor saw me leaving. My stomach tightened. "Make copies of everything?" I said. "Do not confront your mother. And do not keep the originals at your apartment." Paige looked terrified. "Is she stealing from the company?" "I don't know yet. But someone created false paperwork. And someone is moving money." That was the beginning of the secret. It was also the moment my wedding stopped being the most important event of that week. I told Ethan the next morning. He sat at our kitchen table and read his father's letter in silence. When he reached the last page, his hands began to shake. The letter was addressed to Ethan and Paige. Thomas wrote that he wanted his children to control the company together. Lorraine would receive income from a separate trust, the mansion, and generous life insurance. She would remain on the board, but she was never supposed to control the children's shares. My mother said Dad changed his mind in the hospital. Ethan whispered, "The document supporting that claim may be forged." "Maybe. I need independent proof." Ethan pushed back from the table. "The wedding is in 9 days." I knew what he was really saying. His father was dead. His mother was difficult, but she was still his mother. If the documents were genuine, the truth would tear his family apart, just as we were trying to begin our own. "We can postpone the investigation," I said, "but we can't pretend the papers don't exist." He covered his face with both hands. Then he said, "Find the truth." I contacted my former supervisor, Diane Morales, who now ran a private financial investigation firm. Diane agreed to examine the records without alerting Mercer Home. Within 48 hours, she confirmed that the 3 consulting companies had no employees, no public clients, and no evidence of performing real work. One had paid the mortgage on Lorraine's vacation home in Florida. Another had transferred money to Victor Hale. Diane also found something more dangerous. Mercer Home's employee retirement contributions had been delayed for 6 months, even though money continued to be deducted from paychecks. That money was missing. "If this is what it looks like," Diane told me, "this isn't just a family dispute. It could be fraud, embezzlement, tax violations, and a federal benefits case." I felt cold all over. How much proof do we need? Enough to freeze the accounts before the money disappears. A page gave us access to archived board reports. Ethan contacted his father's estate attorney, Martin Shaw, who had retired after Thomas's death. Martin asked us to meet him in person. The old attorney looked heartbroken when he saw the disputed transfer document. "I did not prepare this," he said. "Thomas never intended to give Lorraine control." He opened a safe and removed a sealed copy of the real trust amendment. Thomas's children were supposed to receive immediate joint voting control upon his death. Lorraine's document was false. Martin also had a recording Thomas made 2 weeks before he died. In it, Thomas clearly described his wishes. He said Lorraine had been spending recklessly and that he feared she would treat company like her personal bank. Ethan left the office and became sick beside the parking lot. I held him while he cried. "She lied every day," he said. At the funeral. At the will reading. Every time Paige asked about the company. I wanted to say something comforting, but some pain should not be covered too quickly. "It needs air. It needs truth. Her choices are not your shame," I said. That evening, Lorraine arrived at our apartment without calling. She brought champagne and acted unusually cheerful. "Only 1 week," she said, kissing Ethan's cheek. "I hope we can put all this wedding tension behind us." Then she looked at me. "Olivia, I owe you an apology." Every instinct I had warned me to be careful. "For what?" I asked. "For interfering." The dress, the menu, the flowers. I became overexcited. She poured champagne into 3 glasses. "Let us begin again." I watched her eyes move around the room. She looked at my laptop, the locked drawer in my desk, Ethan's phone on the counter. She was not there to apologize. She was searching for signs that we knew. I smiled and raised my glass without drinking. A new beginning, I said. Lorraine relaxed. Before leaving, she hugged me. Her mouth was close to my ear when she whispered, "Family loyalty is the only thing that lasts." It sounded like advice. It felt like a threat. The next morning, Paige called. Someone had broken into her apartment. Nothing valuable was taken, but every drawer had been opened. The copies of the documents were safe with Diane. We reported the break-in. There was no proof Lorraine was involved, but Diane accelerated the investigation. Martin contacted the company's independent directors. A judge approved an emergency review of the disputed trust documents. But the hearing would not happen until the Monday after our wedding. We faced a terrible choice. Canceling the wedding would alert Lorraine that we were preparing to act. Continuing meant smiling for photographs, while pretending we did not know she had stolen from her children and employees. Ethan wanted to confront her immediately. I stopped him. If she knows how much evidence we have, she may empty the accounts or destroy company records. So we invite her to our wedding. We let her believe she is still in control for 4 more days. He stared at me. "Can you do that?" "I investigate people who lie for a living," I said. "I can smile at your mother for 4 days." But I was not as calm as I sounded. 2 days before the wedding, Elena called to say someone had tried to collect my dress. The woman claimed Lorraine sent her. Elena refused because we had agreed that only I could take it. When I asked Lorraine about it, she laughed. Why would I want that little dress? That night, someone left a white box outside our apartment. Inside was a cheap black funeral veil. There was no note. Ethan wanted to call the police. I agreed, though I knew the veil itself proved nothing. The building camera showed a delivery driver wearing a cap. He had been paid in cash by a woman he could not clearly describe. I did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, I stood in our kitchen, wondering if marrying into this family was a mistake. Ethan found me there. "We can leave," he said. "Tonight, we can get married somewhere else or not get married at all. I choose you, Olivia, not the wedding, not Mercer home. You." I looked at the man I loved. His mother's crimes were not his. But silence would become his if he chose it. "I don't want to run," I said. "I want to finish this. Even if she tries something. Especially then." The night before the wedding, Diane sent me her preliminary report. It traced $2.4 million in improper payments and identified a scheduled wire transfer of another $600,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands. The transfer was set for Monday morning. Lorraine was preparing to take the money and disappear before the court hearing. That was when we knew she had to be stopped at once. Martin and the independent directors arranged an emergency board meeting for Saturday evening, during our reception. A judge signed a temporary order freezing the suspicious accounts at noon on the wedding day. We told no one except Paige. Lorraine arrived at Hawthorne House on Saturday morning wearing cream silk and diamonds. She kissed my cheek and said, "You look tired." "I slept beautifully." I lied. Her smile narrowed. The dress was hanging in the bridal suite. My mother's veil rested in a separate case beside it. At 11:30, my bridesmaids went downstairs to check the flowers. I stepped into the bathroom to take a call from Diane. "The freeze is active," she told me. "The wire can't move." I heard the bridal suite door open. Then I heard the soft click of the lock. I ended the call and walked out. Lorraine stood beside my dress holding an open bottle of red wine. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Then she poured. The wine struck the white silk at the neckline and spread downward like blood. She emptied the bottle slowly, watching the stain widen across the dress I had designed around my mother's veil. I could not breathe. "Why?" I whispered. Lorraine placed the empty bottle on the table. "Because Ethan needs to see what life with you will be," she said. Disappointment after disappointment. "You destroyed my wedding dress." "It was an accident." "You left the bottle too close." "There was no bottle in this room." She came closer. "Who do you think they will believe? Me, or the woman trying to turn my children against me?" So she knew. "Maybe not everything, but enough. Some women need to be reminded where they belong," she said. Then she unlocked the door and walked out. I stood alone with the ruined dress and felt something inside me become completely still. Lorraine believed she had broken me. Instead, she had removed the last reason I had to protect her from public humiliation. My bridesmaids found me 5 minutes later. One screamed. Another began calling the venue manager. Paige looked at the wine bottle, then at my face, and understood immediately. "She did this," Paige said. I nodded. Ethan rushed upstairs. When he saw the dress, all the color left his face. "Where is she?" he asked. I caught his arm. "Do not confront her yet. She destroyed your dress, and in 30 minutes, a court order will be delivered to her. If you warn her, she may leave before the board meeting." "I don't care about the board meeting." "I do." Hundreds of employees have money missing from their retirement accounts. We finished this. His eyes filled with tears. What about us? I looked at the red stain and thought of my mother. She had raised me to understand that dignity was not a beautiful thing someone handed you. It was the decision you made after another person tried to take it away. Me get married, I said. Elena was already on her way. She examined the gown and shook her head. The wine had soaked deep into the silk. There was no time to save it. Then Paige disappeared into her room and returned carrying a garment bag. Inside was a plain white tea-length dress she had planned to wear to the rehearsal brunch before Lorraine rejected it as too casual. It won't fit perfectly, she said, but it's white. Elena worked for 40 minutes. She adjusted the waist, added a narrow silk belt, and repaired one loose seam. When she placed my mother's veil over my hair, the room became silent. The dress was simple. It was not the one I had imagined. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw myself. Not defeated. Not hidden. Ready. Downstairs, 200 guests were waiting. Lorraine sat in the front row beside Victor Hale. She looked calm until the music ended and I appeared at the end of the aisle. Her expression changed. She had expected tears, a cancelled ceremony, and a son rushing to comfort his mother after his unstable fiancé caused a scene. Instead, I walked toward Ethan with my head high. As I passed Lorraine, she glanced at my mother's veil. For the first time that day, she looked uncertain. Ethan took my hands. The ceremony was short. We had written our own vows, but Ethan added one sentence. I promise that no fear, no name, and no family history will ever matter more than the truth we build together. Lorraine's face hardened. When it was my turn, I looked at Ethan and said, I promise I will never ask you to ignore the truth, just to keep the peace. Peace built on silence is only another kind of prison. Then we were married. At the reception, Lorraine performed happiness for the guests. She posed for photographs. She complimented my replacement dress loudly enough for everyone to hear. Much more suitable, she said. I smiled. I'm glad you think so. At 5:30, a uniformed courier entered the ballroom and handed her a sealed envelope. Lorraine read the court order beside the champagne fountain. Her hand tightened around the paper. Victor leaned over her shoulder. His face turned gray. They left the ballroom together. Paige followed. Ethan and I waited 30 seconds, then joined them in the library, where Martin Shaw and 3 independent Mercer home directors were already seated around a long table. Diane stood beside a projector. Lorraine stopped in the doorway. What is this? She demanded. Martin spoke first. An emergency meeting of the Mercer home board. At my son's wedding. You scheduled a fraudulent offshore transfer for Monday morning. Diane said. The timing was your choice. Lorraine turned toward Ethan. You did this? You stole our shares, he said. You forged Dad's signature. Your father changed his mind. Martin placed the authentic trust amendment on the table. No, he did not. Victor moved toward the door. One of the directors blocked him. You should stay. Your consulting companies are part of the report. Diane displayed the transfers one by one. Money from Mercer Home had paid Lorraine's personal mortgage, renovation bills, luxury travel, and fees to Victor. Employee retirement contributions had been diverted to keep the company's cash balance from revealing the theft. Lorraine denied everything. She said Thomas had authorized the expenses. She said the employees' money had been delayed because of an administrative error. She called Diane incompetent, Martin senile, Paige ungrateful, and me a gold digger. Then the recording began. Thomas Mercer's voice filled the room. He sounded tired but clear. He described the trust. He named Ethan and Paige as the rightful voting shareholders. He warned that Lorraine had already attempted to move company funds for personal use. Lorraine's confidence cracked. Turn that off, she whispered. No one moved. Turn it off, she screamed. Ethan stopped the recording. For a moment the room was silent. Then Lorraine looked at me. She finally understood. You, she said. This is all you? No, I answered. The transfers are yours. The forged document is yours. The missing retirement money is yours. I only followed the numbers. You invaded my family. Paige stood up. Her voice shook, but she did not look away. We're your family. You stole from us too. Lorraine turned to Ethan. Tell them to leave. I am your mother. Ethan's face looked older than it had that morning. You destroyed Olivia's dress because you thought hurting her would make me easier to control, he said. You lied about Dad. You endangered the company and stole from people who trusted us. Being my mother does not erase what you did. The board voted to remove Lorraine as chief executive immediately. Her access to company systems and property was canceled. Ethan and Paige were recognized as the lawful voting shareholders, pending final court confirmation. The directors also voted to refer the evidence to federal and state authorities. Lorraine stared around the table as each person raised a hand. Her empire disappeared in less than 2 minutes. But she was not finished. She reached into her purse, pulled out a small silver lighter, and grabbed the authentic trust document from the table. Before she could ignite it, Paige knocked the lighter from her hand. Victor ran. He made it into the hallway before two police officers stopped him. Martin had contacted investigators that afternoon after the court signed the freeze order. Lorraine watched Victor being led away and realized he was not going to protect her. He did it, she said quickly. Victor handled the money. I signed what he gave me. Victor laughed from the doorway. Now I did it? He said. Tell them whose idea the offshore account was. That was the final collapse. They began accusing each other in front of everyone. No one needed my secret anymore. Lorraine and Victor were destroying each other with the truth. An investigator asked Lorraine to come with him for questioning. She was not handcuffed that evening, but she had to surrender her passport. She walked out through the side entrance while music from our reception drifted down the hall. Before leaving, she turned to me. You think you won? She asked. I looked at the woman who had poured wine over my dress and spent years teaching her children that love meant obedience. No, I said. I think you finally lost what never belonged to you. The reception continued. It was not the celebration we had planned. Rumors moved through the room. Some guests left early. Others stayed close, hoping to witness another scene. Ethan and I considered ending the evening. Then Paige asked the band to play our song. Your mother has taken enough from today, she said. Don't give her the rest. So we danced. My borrowed dress pulled slightly at the waist. One of my shoes was stained from the wine on the bridal suite floor. Ethan's eyes were red from crying. It was not perfect. It was honest. During the final song, the venue manager brought out my ruined gown in a protective bag. She asked whether I wanted her to throw it away. I almost said yes. Then I touched the dark red silk and remembered what the dress had witnessed. Keep it safe, I said. I'm not finished with it. The investigation lasted 11 months. Victor accepted a plea agreement and gave prosecutors emails, account records, and recordings of conversations with Lorraine. The evidence showed that Lorraine planned the fraud, while Victor created the shell companies and false paperwork. Lorraine eventually pleaded guilty to charges involving wire fraud, employee benefit theft, and falsifying financial records. She avoided the longest possible sentence by returning property and cooperating in the recovery of funds, but she still went to federal prison. The mansion and vacation home were sold. Most of the stolen money was recovered through frozen accounts and asset sales. The employees' retirement accounts were restored first. Ethan and Paige could have used company funds to protect their own inheritance. Instead, they approved a personal contribution from the family trust to cover every employee loss, including missed investment growth. Dad built the company with those people, Ethan said. They should not pay for what our mother did. A Mercer home survived, though barely. Paige became interim chief executive. She was terrified on her first day. 6 months later, employees voted her the most trusted leader in the company's history. Ethan remained an architect but joined the board. He also began therapy. It took time for him to understand how deeply his mother had trained him to confuse guilt with responsibility. Our marriage needed care too. There were nights when Ethan woke from dreams about his father. There were days when I became angry because part of him still missed Lorraine. At first, I did not understand how he could miss someone who had hurt us so deliberately. Then I realized he was not only grieving the mother he had. He was grieving the mother he had spent his life hoping she might become. I could not punish him for that. Revenge may end a battle, but it does not heal the people who survived it. Healing required something harder than exposing Lorraine. It required patience, boundaries, and the willingness to speak before resentment became another family secret. 3 months after the trial, I visited Lorraine in prison. I did not go because she asked. She had written Ethan 12 letters, Paige 9, and me none. Ethan refused to see her. Paige was not ready. I went because I wanted to know whether I still needed her apology. Lorraine entered the visiting room wearing a plain uniform. Without her pearls, her mansion, and her careful lighting, she looked smaller. She sat across from me behind the glass. Did Ethan send you? She asked through the phone. No. Then why are you here? To return something. I held up a photograph of the ruined wedding dress. Elena had transformed it. She cut away the darkest sections and used the remaining silk to create small white and burgundy quilts. One went to Paige. One stayed with Ethan and me. The third was auctioned at Mercer Home's annual benefit for employees facing family emergencies. The quilt raised $48,000. You turned my dress into something useful, I said. Not in the way you intended, but you did. Lorraine stared at the photograph. You came here to humiliate me. No. I came to tell you that you cannot ruin things anymore. Not the dress. Not Ethan. Not Paige. Not me. Her mouth tightened. You took my children. Your choices pushed them away. They will come back. maybe one day. But only if you stop demanding that forgiveness erase consequences. For the first time since I had known her, Lorraine had no polished answer. I waited for an apology. It did not come. And to my surprise, I did not need it. I placed the phone back on its hook and walked away. 2 years later, Ethan and I returned to Hawthorne House for our anniversary. We stood beside the lake where our guests had gathered after the ceremony. I wore my mother's veil over a blue summer dress just long enough for Ethan to take a photograph. Then we sat under an oak tree and ate sandwiches from the same coffee shop where we first met. Paige joined us later with her husband and their baby daughter, Rose. Mercer Home was profitable again. The company had created an independent ethics office and an employee seat on the board. Paige refused to put the family name above the entrance of the new headquarters. "A company is more than one family," she said. Ethan framed that sentence in his office. "People sometimes ask whether I regret allowing the board meeting to happen during our wedding reception. I do not." Lorraine chose the timing of her theft. She chose the offshore transfer. She chose to destroy the dress. She believed cruelty would make me emotional, careless, and easy to discredit. She made the mistake of thinking calmness was weakness. But I also learned that justice is not the same as becoming crueler than the person who hurt you. I did not invent evidence. I did not lie. I did not destroy Lorraine's life. I opened the door, and the truth walked through it. The small quilt made from my wedding dress now hangs in our bedroom. A deep burgundy line crosses the white silk. It is beautiful because the stain is still visible, not because it disappeared. That is what survival looks like to me now. Some wounds cannot be erased. But they can be cut into new shapes, stitched to something stronger, and turned into proof that the person who tried to ruin you did not get the final word. Lorraine poured wine on my wedding dress to show me where I belonged. In the end, I belonged exactly where I chose to stand, and she was the one who lost everything.